Now, it's almost 3 weeks since the US election, can you believe it? More than 2 weeks since I came back from covering it for you, and the argy-bargy continues, and Donald Trump is yet to concede. I'm certain you're aware of that. Anyone sick of this farce yet? Now, yes, I warned you before the election that it would be close and the result might hinge on late counting and even some legal challenges. And I've pointed out for years that the Democrats never accepted the last election result. They called fraud, they ran conspiracy theories about the Russians, and they just set out to be the resistance rather than the opposition. But that was deplorable, and I won't endorse it from any side of politics. Now, on this show, we even showed claims of voter harvesting and electoral fraud weeks before this election. And yes, we also looked at how the special pandemic rules for mail-in voting were going to dramatically increase the turnout, increasing hopes for the Democrats, of course, but also opening up the risk of even more fraud than usual. And yes, I strongly believe that any candidate has every right to highlight irregularities and launch legal challenges. That's a crucial part of election fairness. But now, and this is one of those big buts, but now it's important to say, surely enough is enough. Donald Trump and his legal team raised some reasonable questions early on. They took some reasonable legal action, but they've become increasingly manic. And they've not produced the hard evidence. Rudy Giuliani, such a respectable figure in his own right, sounded loopy last week. And today we've heard this from another Trump lawyer who was often standing aside, right alongside Rudy Giuliani.
Georgia's probably going to be the first state I'm going to blow up, and Mr. Kemp and the Secretary of State need to go with it because they're in on the Dominion scam with their last-minute purchase or award of a contract to Dominion of $100 million.
Just to clarify, you're saying that Governor Kemp, who's been a longtime ally of the president, is directly involved because of financial benefit in the conspiracy to defeat the president in Georgia?
We have certainly been told that there is evidence of that, and it would warrant an investigation if anybody were actually going to do an honest investigation.
What more could you tell us about that alleged conspiracy? Is the governor's involvement?
I can't give you any more details than that now.
Oh boy, Sidney Powell reckons Hugo Chavez and the CIA are in on this as well. I mean, the only thing she didn't mention was the grassy knoll. The Trump camp has now disowned her. Even they thought she took all of this just a little too far. One of the president's longtime allies, the former Republican governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, has run out of patience.
Quite frankly, the conduct of the president's legal team has been a national embarrassment. I've been a supporter of the president's. I voted for him twice. But elections have consequences, and we cannot continue to act as if something happened here that didn't happen. You have an obligation to present the evidence. The evidence has not been presented.
The president needs more friends like Chris Christie. Trump needs to admit defeat. He needs to concede. Every day he doesn't damages his country and its institutions. The fundamental strength of democracy is that the voters never get it wrong. And the crucial authority on which all that hinges is losers' consent. You've heard me talk about losers' consent so many times. Trump needs to offer his losers' consent to a new administration. It'd be a hell of a Thanksgiving present to his nation. Let's catch up with the Federal Education Minister, Dan Tehan, now, who joins us from Western Victoria. Good to talk to you again, Dan. I want to start on the President. Of course, your leader, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has rung to congratulate Joe Biden. You don't want to interfere in American politics, but it makes it increasingly difficult to deal with a country when you can't assume that Joe Biden is the President-elect.
Oh, look, we've got full confidence in the US system, the fact that the United States institutions will sort this out. The Prime Minister's obviously moved to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden, and we're confident in the strength of the US political system, the strength of its institutions, and we're sure that there will be a proper transition in the United States.
You must be worried, though, about the damage that's being done to those institutions in the meantime.
Well, look, we don't want to comment on US processes. As you know, politics is incredibly hard fought in the United States, but we have full confidence, as I've said, in the US institutions, and that's why the Prime Minister rang President-elect Joe Biden to congratulate him, and we're sure that there will be a smooth transition to Joe Biden. The institutions of the US have been they've been a leader when it comes to ensuring democracy is upheld right across the world, and we've got confidence that they'll be able to see this transition through, and that US democracy will be just as strong as it's always been after the transition.
Yes, let's hope so. Those people who get too cocky about Australia need to remember 2010 and a whole nation waiting days to see what reprobates like Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott would do to decide the outcome. So at least they've got legal processes looking at this one. I want to bring you back to the pandemic management then, and I showed earlier in the program comments from Gladys Berejiklian, who in the past couple of days has been brave enough to suggest that in the new year we need to open up more places in our international quarantine for international students. This is sensible, isn't it? If we can find the quarantine places, we've got to try and bring more international workers and students into the country.
Well, the international student market is worth $40 billion to the Australian economy. It creates 250,000 jobs, so we do need to get international students back into the country, but we've got to do it in a safe way, and that's why we're working with every state and territory to do that. Obviously, our priority has been to get as many Australians back before Christmas, and that continues to be our priority, but we've asked every state and territory government to provide us with a plan as to how they could safely bring international students back after Christmas. We've asked for those plans by the end of this month, and we're hoping that we'll be able to work cooperatively with all state and territory governments, that once we've got those Australians who want to return back by Christmas, we can then move to look how we can safely start to bring international students back into the country.
Would you also look at different scales of quarantine or pandemic checks for people from different countries? I've just done 2 weeks quarantine. It is pretty onerous, but what would I expect because I was returning from North America? But if you were coming in from Japan or Singapore or China, wouldn't there be the potential to have people present a COVID negative test and perhaps consent to have one 7 days after arrival or some such? Not, in other words, something less than 2 weeks full quarantine?
What we've asked every state and territory to do is to put together plans to present to the Commonwealth Government, and as part of those plans we want them signed off, especially around quarantine, by their chief medical officers. So we've said that what we want to do is, as we have all along through this pandemic, is take the advice of the medical experts, and so every plan that's submitted by a state and territory government we want signed off by the chief medical officers. Now, if they see that there are opportunities to safely quarantine people outside of hotel quarantine, then that's something that we're prepared to discuss and look at with them. But they obviously need to be signed off by their chief medical officers, because the ultimate responsibility for quarantine lies with states and territories. And so we want to make sure that anything that they put forward has been signed off by their chief medical officers.
Now, it's been a hell of a year for not just for universities, but for education from R to 12 as well. Kids in South Australia just last week had a shutdown thrust on them for no good reason. Just how disruptive do you believe this education year has been for school children, and particularly for those in Victoria and those doing Year 12?
Well, one of the really great things, Chris, was that they'd finish Year 12 exams in South Australia. So fortunate for those Year 12 students in South Australia, they'd got their exams out of the way, so it didn't impact on them. And also, fortunately, obviously, the shutdown there ended up being for a very brief period of time. In Victoria, we obviously saw the pandemic hit and lead to that loss of face-to-face teaching for nearly 4 months for some students. So one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to look at the evidence now and get a real sense of what has been the impact. We know from what the experts have told us that lack of face-to-face teaching will really impact Indigenous students, students from low socio-economic backgrounds, those with a disability, and those from regional and rural areas. So I'm really looking forward for us to being able to monitor and have a look at that, and we'll be able to do that, for instance, through NAPLAN next year and get a sense of, all right, has it led to students missing out? Do we need to provide resources to help students catch up? And you've already seen from the Victorian State Government, for instance, an initiative to put tutors into the classroom next year to help those students who might have fallen behind. So we've just got to make sure we're getting the evidence that we can monitor it, and then obviously from a Commonwealth Government point of view, we want to work with states and territories to make sure that we can help and support those students who have fallen behind.
Yeah, good stuff, and hopefully with all the experience of this year, some of those states will be less trigger happy to shut schools down next year when there's likely to be more outbreaks here and there. Thanks for joining us, Dan. I appreciate it.
Well, no problems, Chris. And as you know, the medical experts have always said it's safe to keep the schools open. Good to be with you.
Spot on. Thanks, Dan Tehan there, the Federal Education Minister. He's right, and I've shared this with you throughout the year. Never any reason to shut our schools, and we should not allow it to happen again. Ridiculous that South Australia again did it again last week. As Dan Tehan said, though, luckily they've got their Year 12 exams out of the way.